Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Myers. I direct the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And I want to thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. As we all know, the Latin American region and the rest of the world for that matter is in the midst of a public health crisis, but is already dealing with its profound economic consequences. We've seen a range of economic policies coming out of the region over the past few weeks, and even days in some cases, with some already asking for support from the IMF for assistance. Given China's extensive economic partnership with Latin America, it's worth, I think, at this juncture, considering what possible role China will play in the region's recovery. Chinese trade largely helped the region to avoid a major economic downturn after the global financial crisis. China-Latin America trade nearly doubled from 2009 to 2011. But can China step in again in important ways, even as it grapples with its own economic realities? And if so, how? China's government and companies have already extended a much welcome helping hand to Latin American governments and to the US as well, through the donation of medical equipment and technologies. Can the region expect more help from China in the way of trade, for example, financing and investment, maybe even debt restructuring, as China looks also to get back on track? To discuss these and other issues, I am so pleased to welcome our really exceptional speakers today, Joyce Chang and Oliver Stuenkel. Joyce Chang is a member of the Inter-American Dialogue and is Managing Director and Chair of Global Research at JP Morgan. Her research team has won numerous accolades, so many I don't have time to describe them all right now. But in 2014, she was personally inducted into the Fixed Income Analyst Hall of Fame. She's also been named one of the most powerful women in finance by American bankers since 2012, and is also active in a range of charitable and other organizations, including Trickle Up and Girls Incorporated. Oliver Stuenkel is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo, where he runs the São Paulo branch of the School of History and Social Science. He is a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, a columnist for El País and America's Quarterly, and a weekly commentator for Global News. His research has focused on numerous topics, including Brazilian foreign policy, Latin American politics, the global order and emerging powers. He's also done quite a bit of analysis on the China-Latin America relationship specifically and different aspects of it. The second edition of his book, BRICS and the Future of Global Order, was published in February, so I hope you'll all have an opportunity to get a copy of that, hopefully online. I assume it's available at this point. So what we'll do today is to begin with some expert observations and maybe even predictions from Joyce and Oliver. And so please do, and then we'll turn to questions and answers from you all for the majority of the session. So please do send your questions to us either by email at meetings@thedialogue.org or on Twitter through hashtag COVID-19 and LATAM. Both of these are listed on your screen. So Joyce, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and invite you to get us started.
Yes, thank you so much, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to talk about the outlook for China. Well, China was the first into this pandemic crisis, and it's also the first out. So what does it mean to be the first in? Just taking a look at China's performance in the first quarter of the year, we estimate that China actually printed its worst GDP growth on record in the first quarter. We had a fall in GDP that was 41% quarter on quarter due to the lockdown policies and the major disruption in economic activity. We estimate that China shut as much as 80% of GDP. And the lockdown was just listed in Wuhan, the original spot where they first detected the virus, just yesterday. So that was after 11 weeks of a lockdown. But we saw major dislocations, in the services sector, a shock to both the demand and the supply side. So tourism, entertainment, catering services, and very broadly consumption demand, and also major disruptions in the supply chain. Looking at the first quarter in China, the combined January, February activity, we estimate that industrial production declined by 13.5%. Retail sales fell by 20%, and fixed investments in China fell by about 25% in just the first 2 months of the year. Well, if you shut everything off and you begin to turn it back on, how is China returning to work? How ready is China to return to work? What is the second quarter for China looking like? We are looking at a V-shaped recovery taking place in China, despite the risk of a second wave of infections. We think that the second quarter in China will actually recover by about 57%. Now, that is still something where just the cumulative losses for China are still quite staggering. We started the year with a forecast that China would have 5.9% growth, and we've taken down our forecast to only 1.1%. So a massive contraction in the first quarter. As it's returning to work, a V-shaped recovery, but still, a cumulative loss that is, severe for China. And that has implications for the rest of the world. We estimate that every 1 percentage point decline in China's growth takes about 0.5% off of global growth. And for Latin America, that correlation is 1-to-1. 1% off of China is 1% off of Latin America. We have Latin America this year in our forecast contracting by nearly 4%, and a second quarter contraction in Latin America of 23%, with Mexico actually being the most vulnerable, where we see a 35% contraction in GDP in Mexico in the second quarter of the year. So how do we track whether China is coming back online and able to return to work? We've developed a number of high-frequency indicators that we look at and that we track on a daily basis. At the end of March, we actually saw that the work resumption rose like 96% for critical and large-scale enterprises and about 77% for small and medium enterprises. Looking at some major indicators such as coal consumption of major power generators, that's recovered to about 85% of historical levels. Real estate transactions, which had fell to 90% below their historical norms, have recovered to levels that are around the historic average right now. So we are seeing some recovery in China domestically. But the second part of this picture is just the decline in global demand. Global demand continues to weaken, and the worsening of the pandemic globally points to the deepest global recession in the global economy since World War II. And so just to say a bit about the global economy, there's been 8 recessions over the last century, and we view the current recession as worse than what we saw during the 2008 global financial crisis. We're looking at a 2.6% contraction in growth. So it is not as bad as World War II, not as bad as the Great Depression, but worse than the global financial crisis and worse than the post-World War I crisis, which was associated with the Spanish flu. So that hit to global demand will continue to take a toll on China's growth numbers. And weaker exports also, I think, will lead to higher unemployment and more corporate bankruptcies. China has increased the fiscal stimulus. They've increased their fiscal deficit by an additional 3% of GDP. We think this year that the fiscal deficit in China will reach over 14% of GDP, and in the United States, it will reach 12% of GDP. The 12% of GDP in the United States is actually the largest deficit on record in peacetime in the United States. So a cumulative loss, across the 2 largest economies, double-digit fiscal deficits for the U.S. and China as well. And we think the consequence of the fiscal stimulus is that you will see the debt burden, the debt to GDP for China, rise by somewhere between 15 to 20 percentage points. So we are seeing signs that China is getting back on track, but the overall global picture, and the cost of doing this, the fiscal cost, has longer-term consequences for China. lingering concerns about disruptions to the global supply chain that will persist, on concerns of, and the risk still of an imported second wave of the pandemic playing out. And I think that, in talking to many people in China, the real litmus test is whether you can see the schools reopen, at the end of May, June, or is this something where, in order to contain the spread of the virus, they're going to need to keep the schools closed. So that's a bit on China. Now, the last part of the question had been that China stimulus was something of a boon for the region in Latin America. What will be the effect on Latin America this time around? Well, after the global financial crisis in 2008, China's fiscal stimulus was around 7% of GDP. This time, it's less than half that amount, a little bit over 3% of GDP. So it's a smaller fiscal stimulus. Back then, China was also growing, at a much faster pace than the 1.1% that we are expecting for China this year. So I think that it is more difficult now for China to provide the kind of support that it provided after the crisis, given the lower growth rate, the higher fiscal burden that they carry, the much higher debt burden. The debt to GDP in China rose by nearly 100% of GDP after the global financial crisis. So we do see, though, that China continues to provide some support for Latin America. I've heard that they are, fast tracking medical supplies to Latin America. That country like Mexico, that some estimates are that the ventilators for the whole country are only in the order of 2,500, that they have fast-tracked it, but it's not the type of support that China was able to provide after the global financial crisis, just given the size of their debt and fiscal burden this time around. So why don't I just stop there and turn it back to Margaret to introduce Oliver.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That was terrific. And let's head straight to Oliver's comments.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join this debate. I'm just going to make a few comments on sort of Latin America's view on this, adding after what we've heard from Joyce about the economic situation in China. I fully agree. Of course, everybody knows the situation in Latin America is somewhat delayed in comparison to the rest of the world. That makes it, of course, very hard to predict exactly what will be the depth of the collapse of Latin America's economy. But I think there's a lot of evidence that things will be possibly worse than elsewhere in the world so far, worse than in Europe or the United States or Asia. And I think that is important to point out because in general, when I speak to people in the financial sector in Brazil or in government, a lot of people look towards either Europe's or the US experience with the pandemic, even though there's a lot of evidence that shows that there's a lot of potential for the situation to be much worse in Latin America, largely because of much lower investment in public health, because of a part of the population that where social distancing is not viable, and also because there is a near complete lack of coordination amongst governments in the region. It's really quite remarkable how little effort there has been to coordinate a common response between governments. Brazil and Mexico in particular have taken a long time to recognize the severity of the crisis. I would say Peru, Argentina, Chile have had much better responses. So that has basically made any type of regional approach to this impossible. At least here in Brazil, there's of course a massive subnotification of cases, lack of basic medical equipment, and basically just a debate about when the collapse, even the most developed parts of the country, will take place, which, for example, in the state of São Paulo is predicted to occur between late April in the worst case scenario and mid-June in the best case scenario. So the idea is more to push the collapse of the health system as much into the future as possible. As Margaret pointed out very quickly on the situation, on the impact of Latin America-China ties. And before I make that point about just still about Latin America, I think one issue I forgot to mention is, of course, the economic situation in Latin America was very delicate before the pandemic. 2019, Latin America was the country with the worst economic performance in the world. Basically, Brazil in particular had a pretty bad performance last year, the worst in 3 years, actually. So that, I think, with very limited fiscal space for the government to help mitigate the crisis that's coming. So in that sense, I think that's another aspect that explains why many expect this to be much worse in Latin America than elsewhere. We have seen, by the way, now in some cities, in some major cities in Brazil, Rio and São Paulo, particularly in sort of middle lower income neighborhoods, the lockdown is being loosened very quickly, so the measures of social distancing aren't really functioning, which also suggests that flattening the curve will be very difficult. As Margaret pointed out, China was, of course, critical to helping Latin America overcome this crisis after 2008. And there's somewhat of a vague expectation among some policymakers that China can just pull it off once more. So there's some belief in sort of the Chinese superpowers of just helping Latin America get out of this one as well. And I think that overlooks a crucial fact that there's been a bit of a disenchantment in China actually with Latin America over the past 5 years, despite increasing trade relationship. Investment has actually gone down in several parts, and a bit of a disappointment amongst some Chinese investors in Latin America. It's a very tricky environment to operate in. Venezuela, of course, China got its fingers burnt, and also the situation in Brazil over the past years has not been satisfying. So I think in general, we must be very careful to expect, or policymakers in Latin America must be very careful to, if they expect sort of China to be crucial yet again in helping Latin America overcome this crisis. At the same time, I think, of course, that Latin America for investors will be a great opportunity. It will be very cheap. It's a strategic opportunity to engage in the markets because of the depth of the crisis. I think a lot will depend on how the IMF and other multilateral bodies will engage in Latin America. And I think that China has been able to use a bit of a vacuum, a power vacuum over the past decade, and basically strengthened its role because it didn't really compete much with other major actors. And it's quite interesting that in the public opinion across Latin America, the US plays virtually no role in sort of leading the response on the pandemic. And I think the perception that a power shift has taken place and that China is globally leading on this is quickly consolidating in Latin America, and it's seen as increasingly a key provider of global public goods. And that brings me to my last point. Because of the perception, of course, of China's rise and of China's crucial role for Latin America, it has become very politicized. The relationship, I think, between Latin America and China until a couple of years ago was really sort of the stuff for experts. I mean, this is being discussed every month or two in some obscure university or think tank, but not really received any visibility in the public debate. And this has radically changed with, of course, Brazil's the BRICS partnership, but also with Bolsonaro's election, who was the first major politician who played the anti-China card. And I think this is really here to stay. I mean, a lot of people are concerned about the anti-China rhetoric, which is now come back with a lot of energy. As President Sun, the Minister of Education, are openly attacking China as a means to show the U.S. government that Brazil is sort of doing something to limit China's influence in Latin America, which creates a lot of worries amongst governors, for example, who are much more aware than the federal government of the need for a Chinese aid, in particular medical supplies, to make it through the crisis. But it's also profoundly popular amongst Bolsonaro supporters to attack China, something that was just not part of the Latin American debate until a couple of years back. Enemies or opponents are increasingly being attacked as sort of being too close to China, something that we've only seen in the past vis-a-vis the United States. So if you were pro-US, you were kind of seen as an entreguista traitor of the fatherland, and this has now basically this applies to China as well now. So China is going to be in the midst of the political debate. In Brazil's case, the ambassador and also the consul general of Rio de Janeiro has fiercely attacked Brazilian politicians who have criticized China for supposedly being guilty of spreading the pandemic. And we've seen really a tension which is almost unprecedented between the two countries. And I would just assume that the reason why China is lashing out and sort of responding to these provocations is because it knows that there's this a part of the Brazilian government which is aware of China's importance, basically asks for, apologizes for these sort of anti-China comments. And China obviously uses this moment of Brazilian weakness to renegotiate aspects of the bilateral relationship. 3 days after Bolsonaro called Xi Jinping and apologized for his son's comments, the Brazilian government also announced that Huawei would not be excluded from the building process of the 5G network in Brazil. So I think this is also these sort of fights, these tensions between Brazil and China are actually paradoxically is a good opportunity for China to renegotiate the relationship more in its favor. And I don't think that there's any real potential for the bilateral relationship to suffer systemically, given that Latin America is just a very important region for China in the long term. So I'll stop here. Bottom line is, I think the situation, particularly in the public in Latin America, hasn't yet fully grasped the depth of the crisis. China is expected to play a key role in the recovery, but I think we must be careful because the China that will emerge from the pandemic is potentially not as capable of helping Latin America as was the case after the 2008 crisis.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Oliver, both for your comments and also for Joyce's. Those are really terrific and really very complimentary. There are a number of really terrific questions coming in. So if you don't mind, maybe I'll pose one or two questions to each of you and you can respond as you'd like. First of all, just given that Oliver was talking about the Brazil-China relationship and unprecedented tensions in that relationship over the past month or so, do you think that China will hold back from? We've seen, of course, some movement, some sort of positive movement toward rebuilding the relationship, reinstating bilateral mechanisms, and some talk about new projects, investment in new infrastructure projects, rail and road, for example. But given this existing tension, will China hold back in providing either immediate medical assistance or perhaps on some of the promised investments and forthcoming finance? Brazil's been a major recipient of finance from Chinese policy banks since 2005. So that's a first question that came through. And then do you think, I mean, we've had about 5 questions so far on the US-China dynamic, and specifically on US-China competition in the region, which really shows few signs of easing, despite the fact that both countries are grappling with extensive economic and health crises, and really, would benefit to a considerable degree from more collaboration and cooperation, especially in the scientific space. But what will be the effect of all of this on views of the U.S. and China? And I know, Oliver, you already alluded to this to a degree, but is there anything that the US should be doing to ensure that it is viewed positively when all is said and done? One specific question asks whether the America Crece initiative, whether how that is currently seen in the region, and whether there's some role for that particular initiative in rebuilding the region post COVID-19. And then Joyce, you've noted that this stimulus is far smaller than the one post 2008, about half of what we saw then. Could you give us a sense of what what it might look like if we do see an uptick in domestic investment? I've heard from some that we might see investment in some very strategic sectors, different forms of infrastructure than we saw last time around. Things like 5G deployment, growing AI applications, developing smart cities around the country. And if that's the case, what implication would growth in those particular industries and growth and capacity in those particular industries mean for Latin America, assuming eventual transfer of those investments to other regions? And beyond that, we have a couple of questions on this disenchantment, that China has in fact withdrawn, and Oliver made this point, has withdrawn from the region to a degree in recent years. Certainly trade, booms, or trade continues to boom, and investment booms some years and slows other years. We saw a real increase in greenfield investment, projects announced in 2019, but a huge decline in Chinese finance to the region. So yeah, there has been something of a tapering overall in growth in the China-Latin America economic relationship. With that in mind, is there enough appetite in China for enhanced engagement, given everything that they're grappling with? Even though we've seen China Development Bank indicate on a couple of occasions that it would support some of the promised investments associated with the Dalton Road initiative. So maybe Oliver, can we start with you on those questions?
Well, yeah, several of those I think I'll leave to Joyce, of course, and Margaret. I think you're the best person to comment on sort of the process of disenchantment as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. But very quickly, what should the U.S. government do? I think not talk about China whenever any policymaker visits Latin America. I think it's a wrong approach. I think that I've listened to numerous leading foreign policymakers from the United States coming to Latin America, and all they talk about is China. And I think it's completely counterproductive. It's basically I think it's based on a serious misunderstanding of how Latin America sees the world. This whole rhetoric about being careful with the Chinese, etc., is just such a I think nobody sort of listens to that and says, well, yeah, perhaps we should really be careful with the Chinese. I mean, it's just everybody who in the room, whenever the Pompeo or Pence or even Tillerson, I mean, they all seem to prioritize this issue. And I sort of understand that from a US perspective, that's a concern, but it's very, very counterproductive because China doesn't talk about the United States when it engages with Latin America. It talks about trade, talks about investment. And I think, I must say, I think it seems to have, I think, a more sophisticated understanding of how to engage with the Latin American public and Latin American policymakers, because sort of the idea of be careful with the Chinese is immediately invites the counter argument, which is sort of obvious, that the United States has been intervening in several moments. I think a lot of Latin America analysts in the United States, of course, very much aware of these trends, but I think that making a US visit to Latin America about the US-Latin America relationship and nothing else is something I haven't seen in quite a while. It's and that I think is the key. So Huawei should not be part of the discussion. I think can be about America Crece or any kind of advantages that the bilateral relationship offers, but not about sort of the supposed control of the Chinese government over Huawei, things like that are just not really an immediate concern for a number of reasons. And I personally may disagree with that, but it just doesn't fly in the context of Latin American politics. So I think that is really a major weakness in the US engagement, and where China's just doing a better job. When it comes to how the anti-China rhetoric, particularly in Brazil, will impact the relationship, I think the Vice President, Mourão, has been to China with the Minister of Agriculture, and they were sort of accepted as the guarantors of a stable relationship, and they were expected to keep things, sort of to keep the radicals' rhetoric vis-a-vis China in check. They were accepted, they're fairly well regarded. Xi Jinping hosted Mourão for 40 minutes, which was seen as a clear sign of goodwill. But now this moderate camp has failed to reduce the anti-China rhetoric, and I think there's somewhat of a re-evaluation going on in Beijing about the bilateral relationship. At the same time, as I said, I think this is also an opportunity where states are terrified, state governors, mayors, etc., write lots of letters and emails to the Chinese embassy and basically say, we're so sorry, these people do not represent what Brazil thinks about you. Please invest in my state. We're urgently medical supplies. So this is also a moment where you can really engage because the several sections of the government are just desperate. So it's a very weak negotiating position. I think I can't see right now an impact on trade and even on investment because of those comments. I think if the president himself should take up sort of anti-China rhetoric, I think it's time to worry. But basically, as long as he delegates it sort of to the radical faction, China must just understand it basically as politicking, which is not really at all about China, but about sort of consolidating support amongst the radicals. I think China's making also a mistake because by hitting back so hard, I think it's also sowing the seeds of xenophobia, because I think the response of the consul general was completely exaggerated, and I think that if China is not careful, the way it responds to these people, even moderates who disagree with the anti-China rhetoric will start to be more critical of China, which in general is seen as much more positive because it's just, or at least more neutral than other major powers.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Joyce, can we turn to you?
Yeah. So look, I think this is a situation that's still playing out, but many of the themes that Oliver brings up, I think they're not just unique to Latin America. I think there are many parts of the world that are, reassessing the relationship with China. And you've seen the statements out of the United Kingdom. I mean, there's the U.S. Rhetoric, which Oliver has mentioned, as well as what's happening in Latin America. But one way I would just frame the discussion is, like, I think that one has to look at what does a more successful recovery in China versus the rest of the world look like. And this is something where, China, because it's not a democracy, has more ways in which it can, enforce the containment. If there's a second wave, they have more ways in which they can enforce that as well and cope with it. So even though 1.1% is, the worst growth performance that China has had, sort of in its modern history, it still could be coming out better than some of the other, countries in the world. Like in the U.S., we think that unemployment will go up by 5 full percentage points from the low that it was at, 3.5%, to 8.5%. And, in January, when everybody talked about this crisis, it was all almost 100% focused on China. Now, if you look at the COVID-19 statistics now, sort of 11 weeks into, the Wuhan lockdown and lifting that, China only accounts for 6% of global infections and only 4% of deaths. It's taking far more of a toll on the developed market countries. So I think one question is, what does potentially a more successful recovery in China mean for versus the rest of the world? I think that China also, because as a source of the contagion, it's also been able to be part of the solution. They have a deeper understanding of the virus than other places. And so you do see that they are trying to fast track medical supplies, including to the United States. And after the phone conversation between Trump and Xi, which often happens when the two of them, actually communicate with each other, some of that tension went down a bit. They stopped calling it the China virus, and then they started talking about the medical exchanges. I think that China takes a very strategic, longer-term view with its relationships, irrespective of who is in power at that point. And so one hears anecdotally that for each of the 54 countries in Africa, they've offered 2,500 free testing kits. That for Mexico, they've offered to fast track some medical supplies. That for the U.S., where tensions are so big, there's also an exchange of knowledge on the medical procedures. And we hear that Jack Ma is writing a whole book on these procedures, that even U.S. hospitals want this. So as a source of the contagion, they've also been able to offer themselves as part of the way in which they're also trying to strategically keep relationships in place over the longer term, seeing beyond just one administration. But the whole question of where are their investment dollars in China going to go? We did a study where we looked at sectors across China and the areas where we thought that China had a real global advantage and the ability to be sort of dominant in the field. And three areas really stood out. Artificial intelligence was one, because China not only has the biggest database given the size of the population, they have full control of it in a way that a democracy cannot have full control over it, given the data privacy concerns. So artificial intelligence is one area where China leads. We also saw that in areas like automation, where just given the demographics in China and that their labor force, the working age labor force, had already peaked, that in automation they're very advanced. You'd mentioned 5G, and I think that still for many of the emerging markets countries, China is able to provide something in a cost-efficient way, more so than other players, where they're still going to continue to have strategic dominance there. And what we see amongst the U.S. companies that are active in China is that they're trying to survive the storm. I don't see a change in strategy in the relationships with China by U.S. companies for areas like consumer goods or financial services or industrials. I think there'll be a lot more question on certain areas like pharma, for example, where just in the aftermath of this, will you want to be getting a lot of these like pharmaceutical goods, through China? I think, 5G is going to, remain on the table as well, not just for the U.S., but you're hearing that out of many of the, Western European countries and developed countries as well, less so out of the emerging markets countries. So, like how China comes out of this crisis compared to the rest of the world, as far as, where they're able to, strategically, try to, really build relationships, because they have a way of, as the first in and first out of this crisis, basically looking at, both the containment measures, but also even just some of the medical, solutions that are still very much, ones that everybody's looking to, which therapeutic treatments, which vaccines could be developed over the next year or 2 years. So I don't think you're going to see a real change in the fact that China is the second largest economy, and given its reach, you really can't change that aspect of globalization. But what you could see is that in certain sectors, there's more caution in working with China. And you could also see that the way that China tries to do the outreach is through these types of medical exchanges and solutions in dealing with this global pandemic. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Joyce. A follow-up question just came into on your comments. Do you see any geographical prioritization of, assuming we see more in the way of outward engagement through finance or investment? Do you see Latin America faring particularly well in that respect, or other regions maybe being of higher priority? Certainly, neighboring regions have been historically of higher priority. There are stronger ties there, and there's more exchange in certain particular ways. Trade is, of course, has been booming with Latin America for many years. But do you see any real shift in geographical distribution of investment or finance from China as a result of all of this?
Yeah, I would say that China has, I think, tried very hard to be a global player across all regions. So I don't think they're actually going to shift that strategy. It is more that they may need to prioritize, given what the country's own domestic politics are, on where there may be more resistance, like which sectors they actually work in. But if you take a look at China now, compared to a lot of people initially at this crisis try to compare, COVID-19 to SARS. But, if you look at just China's role in the global economy, it had transformed so much that, that comparison just did not make any sense. So China is 30% of global manufacturing. You have 150 million Chinese tourists. It's about 18% of the overall, tourism spend, globally. And it's nearly 18 to 20% of global GDP. So I don't think it's so much about that you can change those dynamics. If there's a crisis in China, it's going to become a global crisis, just given China's role in the global economy. You're trying to restrict the borders and contain it that way. What we've seen, and the lesson you've learned from this crisis, is that that's just not going to work. But I do think that China continues to prioritize. And then, much as Oliver says, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, commodity exporters. I think they are also looking at possible disruptions to the supply chain and where can they source goods, not necessarily from the U.S., like what they need for 5G. They used to get many parts from the U.S., and they've been able to substitute in that supply chain. So I think there will be prioritization based on some of the restrictions that are put into place for domestic politics in some of the countries that they do business with.
Yeah. That makes good sense. Oliver, a question for you. Do you believe that the handling of COVID-19 and its implications by various countries, different approaches to economic policy, will be something of a referendum on the effectiveness of democracy or democratic governance versus the so-called China model? How do you see Latin Americans, whether in Brazil or elsewhere, making any comments about this at the moment? Do you see any analysis of this, and where do you think this might head in the coming year? Also, for Oliver, supply chain. Certainly, after the global financial crisis, there was a real push in Latin America to diversify trade partnerships, including to trade more extensively with China. But is there now going to be a similar push to reorient supply chains to ensure, whether across the board or in specific sectors, to ensure that the supply is forthcoming in the event of some sort of catastrophe, crisis, whatever it might look like? And perhaps that's a question for Joyce as well. Oliver, can we start with you?
Sure. I think the impact on democracy in Latin America is something that hasn't been discussed at all because people are so focused on sort of the short-term economic impact. But I think it's a very important point. I think that you can basically tell the history of Latin American politics by just looking at a couple of economic figures, among them growth and commodity prices. And it's basically, whenever commodity prices are low, you have low growth and political instability. I mean, it's not a coincidence that of those governments that are democratically elected in Latin America, you have basically not nobody who's in his her second consecutive term. It's all the first term governments, because growth is so low that the dynamic is very much anti-incumbent. And I think that will continue. In the best case scenario, you have just one government being elected out after the other. In a worst case scenario, you have a severe political instability, because traditionally speaking, if you have sort of extreme economic crises, they usually come along with a lot of political instability and a lot of heads of state possibly having to leave before their term is over. So I would expect a lot of political instability, which, by the way, also will complicate the doing business climate. I think that it's probably not overly pessimistic to say that we will have several countries going into severe political volatility over the next 12 months. And that will make it also more difficult to invest in Latin America, because you have less predictability. Now, as you can see in Brazil, I mean, this is I can't remember a government losing approval so quickly. Of course, this has not only to do with the pandemic, but we've had pot banging taking place in major Brazilian cities every single day for the past 16, 17 days, which was really a sign of how unstable things have become. So even though I think the expectations that Bolsonaro will fall immediately or there'll be an impeachment are exaggerated, I think he's much more, the situation for now is much more stable than people think. I think we will see heads of state falling before their time, before their official mandate's up. Now, clearly, I think there's also a risk to democracy, because there is a very broadly sort of accepted idea that if only, or that in general, authoritarian regimes are sort of better at dealing with these kinds of things. So that's, I would say, clearly something to worry about as the crisis deepens and people are also subject to Chinese propaganda, which is fairly efficient. That things are sort of back to normal in China. So I think that's a serious concern. So I would consider the pandemic to have a pretty important impact on the stability of democracy in the region.
Thank you. Terrific. And Joyce, did you have any comments on either of those questions?
Yeah, no, I think that, when you look at emerging markets more broadly, we see already that 80 countries have approached the IMF for assistance. There's much more talk about a debt standstill or debt relief. There's real concerns, not just in Latin America, but in emerging markets more broadly, that given the cost of this crisis and the fiscal costs and what developed countries are going to have to do, that there isn't a backstop or a lender of the last resort. And I think just growing concerns that in emerging markets, there are going to have to be more global solutions. Are there ways in which you can capitalize the IMF so there's more rapid financing instruments that are available? So it's not just Latin America. I think for the lower income countries as a whole, this is really worse than some of the crises that we've seen in the past cycles. And I think Oliver's point is the right one, and it's really the Achilles heel for Latin America. The low growth had already stoked social tension in the region, and you have the social political feedback loop. Many of the governments have lost their popularity, not just in Latin America, but you see as we look at, across the spectrum, just from the rise of populism and the deglobalization trends, that you've got a number of quite fragile coalitions and precarious politics on top of this, because growth has come down so much. And so I think that we have to be on the watch for political breaks and for social tension to escalate. How are some of these countries who are enforcing the containment through real use of police and military force? I mean, how sustainable is that? And it really depends on what the duration of this crisis is. Is this, initially everybody thought this is a 1-quarter event. Now it's like, well, it's a 2-quarter event, but could you have a second wave and could you have a third wave? So I think that, this is all happening at a point where you have lower growth, fiscal deficits that are widening, much higher debt burdens, and countries really constrained in how they can respond at the same time that you've had weak commodity prices. So there just isn't very much policy space where once at this stage, and there isn't that much space that even for countries that want to help others, where they need to deal with their own domestic priorities as the first concern. So I think you're going to see these political and social tensions play out, and very much, would concur with Oliver's points.
Thank you so much. And then perhaps just a couple of questions to close, which I think are interesting ones. Joyce, you just mentioned sort of, fragile institutions and divisions within countries and among different governments in the region. But do you feel that China could play a role? So far, there's been a real bilateral focus in assistance, right? Delivering medical equipment, medical technologies to specific countries and governments, really across the board. I mean, regardless of their political affiliations and even their affiliation, diplomatically speaking, with China, right? Many of the countries that they have provided assistance to have been are Taiwan's diplomatic allies, to include those in the Northern Triangle. But do you feel China could play a role in perhaps facilitating a common response through regional or sub-regional platforms in which China is already engaged, for example, as an observer of the Pacific Alliance, through the OAS, through the China LAC forum, perhaps more importantly? Does that sound like something that would be viable? And then another question here from one of our participants. What's going to happen with the BRI? What do you expect in terms of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, moving forward, whether, in other regions or in Latin America? Will there be efforts to re-envision it, to redefine it? I know I think probably your guess is as good as mine on that particular topic, but there are some potential opportunities for China to rethink the Belt and Road as something of a stimulus, and even maybe a green one, as we're discussing here in the U.S. as well. Just for everyone's reference or information, the 19 countries in Latin America thus far have signed Belt and Road cooperation agreements, and I don't think Argentina has yet, but if they do, that would be 20. So we'll just end with any thoughts you might have on those two questions.
Yeah, let me just start with
Oliver,
Belt and Road.
Please.
So let me just start with Belt and Road, because I do think that there's been a lot of fanfare and hype around this compared to what the actual investment numbers have been. So that is a longer term strategic China initiative, but the actual amounts of money and projects that had sort of taken off on that was so relatively limited. I mean, there was a much more fanfare about this conceptually than I think what had actually materialized and actually had been delivered. So I don't think it changes the overall Belt and Road strategy, in part because I don't think that it actually had taken off as much as some of the sort of headlines about Belt and Road. That's the first thing I would say. I think that China will remain engaged in the international organizations, and I think you very rightly said that that they also will try to keep the ties open with all kinds of different regimes. That's just the way that China has operated. But I don't necessarily see that you're at a moment on the global cooperation that China alone even really could do that. I mean, you need to have You need to have just a greater consensus. And I think it was Oliver who, when he started his comments, had just said that, look, even in Latin America, you can't get the cooperation, amongst the Latin American states. Like, we're looking at some of these dynamics in the transatlantic relationship, as well between the U.S. and Europe. So I think you're just at a moment right now that China cannot solve sort of, the state of where we're at in the sort of deglobalization, that process that had already started well before you had COVID-19. I think that what China will do is try to focus on areas that will be less politicized, like such as the medical issues and the sort of affect developed countries and emerging markets countries, and whether they can actually get emergency supplies, medical knowledge, some of that technology there. And I think I think that's where that's where China will feel that you're going to get much less pushback on sort of what their role is, because it really is just addressing the humanitarian crisis that's at hand. So let me stop there.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Oliver, last word.
Yeah, first of all, I apologize. I forgot to answer one of the previous questions, and I think I'll just use that minute now to do so, and then look into the immediate future, also considering the U.S. presidential elections and what they mean for that triangle. I think that in terms of, somebody asked about the concern and attempts to diversify trade ties between Latin America and the rest of the world. I think certainly there is a concern about growing dependence on China, but considering that Latin America's economy in general is much less impacted by sort of high value add products, for Latin America to diversify more is actually quite difficult. I mean, who is now willing to sign trade agreements with commodity exporters and very efficient countries with a very efficient agriculture? I personally don't expect the EU at this stage to ratify the Latin America EU deal. I think it's a shame. I think it would be a positive for the region to diversify. I just can't expect either Trump or a Biden to sign a Mercosur Latin America, a Mercosur US trade deal. So I think basically Latin America, in that sense, doesn't have the option to diversify. They would very much like to do so. What I do see is that, in particular in Brazil, we had the first government in decades, or perhaps ever, that actually embraced a free trade rhetoric, which sort of clashed with the more traditional nationalist voices in Brazil. We're above all a protectionist country that's very skeptical of globalization and of basically anything that comes from abroad. And I think that will now resuscitate with full force, because for somebody who's against international trade, the pandemic is just a great argument to say that it's really irresponsible to have to import things like medicine or ventilators or masks. So I think it could lead to the resurgence of economic nationalism across Latin America. So because people will say, well, it's really important that when the next pandemic hits, that we're more self-sufficient. So I think in general, also the pandemic is a bad news for free trade agreements. And Brazil came late to the party. It wanted to open up when everybody else was already tired of globalization. So I think that's going to make free trade in general in Latin America more difficult. And just a final comment about the elections. I think that particularly if Biden wins and the US will play a more constructive role on climate change, inevitably that will be a strain on US-Brazil relations. And even though I'm very much supportive of sort of a more constructive position on the US, it will also carry the risk of pushing Brazil deeper into China's sphere of influence, always remembering that China decided to publicly laud Brazil's environmental policies at the height of the Amazon fires last year. So in that sense,
Mhm.
it will be an opportunity for China to deepen its engagement in Brazil if a new U.S. administration sort of takes a tougher stance on environmental policy. So that may be good news sort of for a Chinese perspective in Latin America. So we'll stop here.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in virtually thanking Joyce Chang and Oliver Stuenkel for their really fantastic, thought-provoking, and wide-ranging commentary. Also, Caitlin Blansett from the Dialogue for her technical assistance. I encourage you to follow both of our speakers and their excellent and extensive work online to whatever extent possible. Please, everyone, be well and do be in touch. And thank you again.